South Africa saw a current account deficit in 2022 for the first time in 3 years as imports rose and exports were hampered by several issues, increasing the country's susceptibility to external shocks. In a report from the South African Reserve Bank, the balance on the current account, the broadest measure of trade in goods and services, fell to a deficit of 0.5% of gross domestic product, or 31.8 billion rand, around $1.7 billion, from a surplus of 3.7% in 2021. Joining me now from South Africa is Clive Ramathibela Smith, business and market analyst with Hectare Capital and Partners. Clive, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, my sister. I'm hoping that you're well, and obviously you know that now we are officially grey listed.
It's all right. This competition will continue, but we'll take it off of Business Edge. So, Clive, when we look at this data that has come in now, I think the biggest question would be, what are the factors responsible for the high import volume as against the exports? Even though we know in the past 3 years, there's been COVID, there's the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and of course, there's load shedding. Is that all there is to it?
Yes, and there's more. So you are spot on. Those crises that you're referring to are very, very eminent in South Africa. It's things that are actually currently happening. The power issues, the issues of trade. But also, I want to add to that, my sister, is the serious problems of our unfortunate situation with the floods that created a lot of backlog with our ports, particularly KZN, Durban. And also on top of that, we had challenges with the European Union, for example, in terms of South African local goods being exported internationally. So you know, it's a concussion of bad news that leads to worse. And unfortunately, we have a leadership crisis, I believe, in the current presidency. The fact that they're not making stringent measures to make sure that they protect the South African economy. Not only that, I mean, I'm sure you saw we've now announced the new Minister of Electricity.
Yes.
Very trusted guy, but nonetheless, it means that another bloat extension into our domestic fiscus. So we are sitting with a situation that is very, very serious, very critical, and unfortunately, the levers of the economic structures that have been put in place, including the likes of the NDP 2030 targets, are failing dismally because of an inconsistent economy, a high inflation, and also a high unemployment rate, unfortunately, on the domestic front. So all those things, now you have a current account deficit. Now you're sitting with assets that are owned by foreigners in your country, and whatever happens in those foreign countries or foreign ownerships and partnerships, it means that South Africa is now volatile to those changes, and they can actually turn us into a very negative perspective. Keeping in mind, by the way, the last quarter last year, again, another decline in GDP, down by 1.9%, which shows evidence of a cracking economy that's not sustainable.
So all of this paints a really dire picture, and it paints a picture that might be here for many people. Let's break this down in real terms for the South African economy, in real terms for the South African who has to find his way or her way through these very difficult times and situations. What does this current account deficit mean?
It means it's going to be more difficult for local South Africans to create more jobs because foreigners own more assets than the local domestic economy. Two, it means that there's going to be challenges with other South African companies investing further in South African products rather than going overseas. So that means that even things like investment confidence will depreciate, because obviously if you do not believe in your own country and you're relying on foreigners to run the country for you in terms of running the margin, the lion's share of the margin, it increases risks such as exposure to currency deficiencies. It also increases risk because South Africa is a heavily resource-based country. So that means that prices will also be compromised in terms of currency exchange. By the way, just another thing there that we need to add on to that, because it's important to understand the role of the South African Reserve Bank in this instance, which has been taking up interest rates in the country. This means now they must be very careful, because if they increase these rates and inflation still stubbornly remains as high as it is, that might just also create another downturn in the first quarter of 2023, which might lead to a technical recession, because we would have had 2 consecutive quarters of negative results.
Okay, so you've taken me to 2 of my final points, but one of the things is, in terms of seeing these vulnerabilities and the volatility that comes with external shocks that South Africa is exposed to, how do you think the vulnerabilities may manifest? Because it's easy for us to, again, as I said, paint a picture, but what are the real things that South Africa right now needs to be looking out for, both the Treasury, the administration of Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as the South Africa Reserve Bank, when it comes to these vulnerabilities unfortunately being exploited in the global economic situation that the world is experiencing? How do you think they might manifest?
Well, economically, there are 3 things that you can do to sort of like twist things around, if you want to call it that. One of those is applying, obviously, fiscal discipline within the domestic range, which the president has failed to do as we speak right now. So that's a concern. And we are worried because 2024 is an election year. National elections are coming up. So we don't know what the plan is going to be, because everything now becomes destabilized on the factors that there's an election coming. Secondly, one of the biggest things that you can do in this particular instance is to create a control in terms of your revenue and where it's been applied and where it's going to be utilized. And we have a very fantastic SARS, the South African Revenue Services, probably one of the best in the world in terms of collecting. And the man at the helm there has been carrying this job like you will not believe, and has incrementally been able to squeeze out the little that is in South Africans that they have. Because remember, because of the high unemployment, we only have a very small tax base, meaning that whatever it is that we're collecting, it's at the brunt of the taxpayer themselves, and so they need to suffer, and so they've been creating this particular problem. But to ease down such things, such collective bargaining that's been taking place, that might just make it easier for us to be able to sustain this terrible period of time that we're in, and be able then to recuperate some of the losses due to things such as corruption, by the way, I must just add that, which could create a little bit of a buffer for South Africa. Lastly, and most importantly, nothing is strengthening, nothing is more positive than to have a proper structured economic policy that is what they call radical in this country, which we've not seen before. And so unfortunately, the widening gap of the have and have nots, the inequality structured, which is bearing some past into it because of apartheid, but now it's 30 years later, there is no excuse. It needs to be closed in, and we need to create that internally. And if you can do that, then you start to attract new investments, and you start attracting new companies, new businesses, infrastructure, and then therefore you can start talking about expanding and going back into the positive in terms of our current account.
All right, so Clive, before I let you go, very quick, we've seen that the central bank's quarterly projection model in January shows that it expects a current accounts gap of about 1.7% of GDP in 2023. Is this realistic, very briefly, in terms of what we know and what we see about everything happening in South Africa?
You know what they say, my sister, seeing is believing. It's a very good Tswana term that we use there to say that meaning just we will see when it happens. But the reality is the increments in by the central bank, the economic instability globally, including what's happening in the US, by the way, with tech companies and tech banks and tech investors being under pressure. South Africa has invested quite considerably in that. And one of the companies actually affected directly is listed on the Johannesburg Securities Exchange. So it's going to be very, very difficult. I wish it does happen. But remember last time I said I wish something, unfortunately it didn't happen.
Clive, it's always a pleasure to have you. There's no way that inside these conversations we don't find a way to lighten the tension one way or the other. But it's something we'll continue to watch very closely. 3 years, it's expected to see some of this negative results given what the world and South Africa has experienced. But what now needs to be done is how South Africa brings itself out of here and stays out of that recession red zone. Clive Ramathibela Smith, as always, thank you so much.